Okay, in this video we're going to look at the first set of demand and supply side factors and link them to how each of them impact inflation. So the ones we're going to look at in this video, and again making links to demand pull and cost push inflation, sometimes it's only one, sometimes it's both. We're going to look at interest rates, inflationary expectations, real disposable income, lower income taxes, and then both an appreciation and depreciation of the Australian dollar. So starting with interest rates. In Australia in recent years, the cash rate's currently at 1.5%. While that's not directly impacting inflation, the fact that that decreased to 1.5% flows on to lower rates for mortgages and car loans and and credit card loans and all the other different types of interest is what's really important. So explain how lower interest rates first impact demand pull inflation. So you need to link interest rates to both. When we have lower interest rates, people spend more. Consumers spend more, businesses spend more, both of those lead to demand shifting to the right. So lower interest rates increase the discretionary income of households, it's cheaper to finance existing loans, and it also makes households more willing to go into debt. That both leads to increased consumption spending, and along with the fact that businesses are more willing to spend because they're not as worried about being in this debt, it leads to both increased consumption and investment spending. So consumption increases and investment increases, and because they're both components of aggregate demand, that means aggregate demand shifts to the right, and that leads to demand pull inflation. So lower interest rates can lead to an increase in demand pull inflation because they boost both consumption and investment spending, which leads to shortages, which flows on to higher prices. From a cost-push inflationary point of view, so from the supply side, lower interest rates do reduce firms' costs of production when they have existing variable rate loans. So that can increase their willingness to supply. So the demand curve will shift to the right, which can lead to some demand pull inflation, but it can help to reduce some cost-push inflation because we're likely to see supply shift to the right because of the lower cost of production. Overall, however, the demand side impact is significantly stronger. So we would expect that lower interest rates lead to higher inflation because will cause a big increase in demand and only slight improvements in the level of supply, overall leading to increased inflation in the economy. So when you're talking about recent changes in interest rates, they've gone down to 1.5%, and that leads to increased inflationary pressures throughout the economy. Inflationary expectations is another one. Basically what that means is what we think is going to happen to inflation in the future. And the problem is if people think inflation is going to occur, they do two things. One, they demand higher wages. So when people think prices are going to go up, they want their nominal wages to go up at the same rates to protect their real wages. So when inflationary expectations are likely, workers demand higher nominal wages, which flows on to higher costs of production for businesses, and that can lead to some cost-push inflation. So inflationary expectations can lead to some cost-push inflationary pressures because people demand higher wages. On the flip side, it can also lead to increased spending. If people think prices are going to go up, they want to spend now before the prices do go up. So inflationary expectations can also lead to increased demand pull inflation. The higher consumption spending will boost demand pull inflation, while higher wages lead to higher costs of production for firms, and both of those will lead to inflationary pressures. So inflationary expectations can lead to both higher demand pull and cost push inflation. Higher real disposable incomes, again, need to define real disposable incomes, is about our incomes after direct taxes adjusted for inflation, and it essentially means that consumers have more purchasing power. That will help to boost consumption spending. Consumers will spend more on things like cars and clothes and other items, which will then lead to shortages throughout the economy, and that can essentially lead to increased demand pull inflation throughout the economy. Higher real disposable incomes did fall for a period because of the lower commodity prices, but they have increased slightly in recent years. Lower income taxes is more than just real disposable incomes. Lower income taxes, the main change in recent years has been the increase in the 32.5 tax bracket. So now we pay 32.5 cents up to 80,000 instead of starting to pay 37 cents at 80,000, which means you essentially have got a bit more income. You need to link lower income taxes to both demand pull and cost push inflation. Essentially what they will do is they will shift the demand curve to the right because we'll have more money, and supply will shift to the right because of the increase in participation. So from a demand pull inflation perspective, this is the main impact. Lower taxes will boost disposable incomes, which leads to increased consumption spending, and that can create some demand pull inflationary pressures. There'll be more spending on consumer durable products, etc., cars, furniture, clothing, etc. That all leads to shortages and higher prices throughout the circular flow and demand pull inflation. There is reasons why lower taxes will help to reduce cost push inflation though. So it can reduce firms' costs of production, and that happens for two reasons. One, workers are likely to be more productive when they get a tax cut because they get to keep a higher percentage of their earnings. Then the higher productivity can flow on to increased to lower prices because it lowers firms' cost of production. And secondly, lower income taxes encourage people to join the workforce. So that leads to an increase in participation. The increase in participation leads to increased competition for jobs, which all helps to reduce wage pressures and costs of production. So both of these factors can potentially lead to lower cost push inflation. One, because workers are more productive because they get to keep more of their money. And two, the increases in participation then increase competition for jobs and keep wage pressures down. As a whole, the demand pull inflationary impacts from increased spending will outweigh any decreases in prices from the boost in aggregate supply. So we're likely to see an increase in inflation when we lower income taxes. And the last one is the dollar. The dollar has a big impact on inflation. So if the dollar depreciates, for example, it can lead to both demand pull and cost push inflation. So demand will shift to the right and supply will shift to the left. So like in microeconomics, if demand shifts right and supply shifts left, you're going to get significantly higher prices. A depreciation of the dollar is synonymous with increased prices on both the demand and the supply side, like a double effect. From a demand side perspective, a depreciation of the dollar means that foreign currencies have increased purchasing power against the AUD. Make sure you define that in your answer, and that boosts their demand for our exports. They're cheaper for overseas countries, and that increases export demand. This leads to an increase in sales for the export sector, which they're likely to lead to increased investment spending, and potentially will lead to higher incomes and increased consumption spending as well. So both of this will lead to increased X, increased C, increased I, and all of that's going to lead to increased demand for Australian goods and services, which will flow on to increased demand pull inflation. A depreciation leads to increased exports, it leads to increased investment spending because of the higher profits, and it boosts consumption spending because workers have higher incomes because of the boost in wages. All of that leads to increased demand. From a supply side perspective, a depreciation also increases the cost of imported goods used in production. So our dollar's got less purchasing power, so not only is there more demand for Australian products, but it's also costing us more to produce if we're using imported products from overseas. That will lead to an increase in cost push inflation, and therefore both demand pull and cost push inflation will increase. So the overall impact is significantly higher inflation because of both higher demand pull and cost push inflation. If the dollar was to appreciate, that would both lead to a decrease in inflation. Demand would shift to the left, aggregate demand, and supply would shift to the right, which both leads to less inflation. So from a demand perspective, a depreciation would reduce the purchasing power of foreign currencies. That would reduce their demand for our exports, decreasing incomes of consumers, decreasing investment spending, flowing on to lower factor incomes, and all of this will lead to decreased demand for Australian goods and services. On the cost push side of things, an appreciation can lead to higher cost push inflation because the imports used in production become more expensive. This is the imports used in production become cheaper if the dollar appreciates, which will lower firms' cost of production and make them more willing to supply. That will all lead to decreased cost push inflation as well. Both types of inflation go down, so an appreciation is highly effective in reducing inflation in the economy. Okay, so which of the following is likely to reduce both demand pull and supply side inflation? The correct answer, is it interest rates increasing? No, because that will lead to higher cost of production, and that will shift supply to the left. Is it increased tax rates on businesses? No, because that's going to lead to higher costs of production for businesses. We haven't studied the terms of trade. An appreciation of the dollar will be the correct answer because that will lead to cheaper import prices and it will lead to an increase in demand for Australian goods and services. Thank you.